Good evening, patrons. I hope ye hail. I am Goodman Bulls. I am but a humble storyteller, like the bards of yore, and tonight I wish to tell you a story about a journey. Not to Bremen, nor to Canterbury, but to Gilead. I can see by your countenances that you're not familiar with such geography. After tonight, this will change. Now, this performance is taken from a series of broadsides known under the moniker of Read the Controversy, wherein we explore the testaments of lunatics, blasphemers, rabble-rousers, and other miscreants of that ilk, and explore not only their tomes and manifestos, but the vox populi, the heart of the modus vulgari that come to protest. Now, I am not a sawbones nor a barber surgeon, but I will attest that this performance is not for those infirm in both heart and liver. This tale features offenses of the carnal variety. To speak in modern parlance, this video will contain discussions of rape, sexual assault, and prostitution, along with extended conversations involving religious extremism and fascism. You have been warned. Now, let us get into the personas dramaticus. The Republican, a statesman who is here to discuss the political culture of the world. The Belletrist, a writer is here to explore the written work. The Evangelist, the religious sort who takes umbrage with these sorts of things. The Suffragette, a theorist of the fairer sex who has her own thoughts on the work. And the Nativist, which younger generations will know as a TERF. However, it is the borders of gender, not country, that she wishes to defend. And I, of course, Goodman Bulls, will be the narrator for this evening. Gaffer, if you could get the lights.
Preamble. The narrator gives a short monologue on the nature of format.
The Handmaid's Tale can most accurately be called dystopian fiction. In the same measure that the Gothic writers treat the house as character, it follows that dystopian writers treat society as one. To read such works without such context leaves much on the table. Is 1984 the story of a man having a midlife crisis and affair, or is it a story that explores the concepts of surveillance, ignorance, and choice? Is Brave New World the story of a guy finding a white native on safari, or is it a book that belies the author's fears of hyperconsumerism, the erasure of monogamy, and capitalist-driven eugenics? And of course you can't ignore historical context in the genre. The fact that Brave New World was published in 1931 and features eugenics as part of its world building isn't a coincidence. The fact that Bradbury lived through World War II and McCarthyism and then proceeded to write about book burning and censorship isn't one either. To understand the dystopian, we must understand its society. To understand its society, we must understand our dystopia. We need to find the frame to put around the mirror that shows the reflection.
Act 1. The Republican speaks of three regimes.
To wit.
So many different strands fed into the Handmaid's Tale. Group executions, sumptuary laws, book burnings, the Lebensborn program of the SS, and the child stealing of the Argentinian generals. The history of slavery, the history of American polygamy. The list is long.
Whereas it be the rape of the Sabine women, or La Melencha and the Mestiza, it's clear that often with conquest of the political, there comes conquest of the reproductive. The tale of the handmaid, in that sense, is circular. Yet another despot, yet another harem. But Atwood, as they say, lived in interesting times. There are three salient events that occurred during Atwood's time. The existence of the Iron Curtain, the rise of neo-evangelism and the moral majority, and the revolution of Iran.
The keyboard was German because I was living in West Berlin, which was still encircled by the Berlin Wall. The Soviet Empire was still strongly in the palace and was not to crumble for another 5 years. Every Sunday, the East German Air Force made sonic booms to remind us of how close they were. During my visit to several countries behind the Iron Curtain, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, I experienced the wariness, the feeling of being spied on, the silences, the changes of subject, the oblique ways in which people might convey information, and these had an influence on what I was writing. So did the repurposed buildings I used to belong to, but then they disappeared. I heard many stories, many times.
Notice that there was an East Germany. implying that there is a West, and indeed there was. The West in the most important sense was America. America the decadent, America the imperialist, America the star child of capitalism. However, though it acted like a land of plenty, a white picket Eden, there were serpents in the garden. The whole political climate leading up to 1984 is honestly horrible and insane. For instance, the Black Panthers were against abortion. They saw it as a form of eugenics. And in 1967, Reagan signed the Therapeutic Abortion Bill as a California governor, which allowed for abortions if they threatened the mother's life. And yes, you did hear that correctly. Reagan had a more humane, pro-abortion stance than many modern Republicans, who are perfectly fine and condone the existence of children being able to carry to term. Before this point, left and right stances are a bit more muddled. There isn't yet a religious consensus on the efficacy of abortion, and even politicians like Ronald Reagan are somehow fairly moderate by our modern standards. So, what changed? Now, I'm not an expert. The American educational system basically doesn't teach anything past Vietnam, but I'll try my best. So first, and this should be obvious, Roe versus Wade. It was codified in 1973, and the main takeaway was that women had a right to privacy based on the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment does a lot of things, but the Due Process Clause basically says that states have to apply the law equally, and not by an arbitrary measure. Since Roe v. Wade is an important interpretation of how this country executes civil liberties, you can understand how it being overturned makes other decisions and other liberties questionable. Okay, but back to the decision. Essentially, the states needed to mind their own business since reproduction affected women's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this throws a monkey wrench into things. The right to abortion was a big deal now. It was a hot topic, and people had a lot of different opinions on it in Roe v. Wade. For instance, some feminists criticized the right to choose for its bias implications, saying that it wasn't about the right to choose, but reproductive justice. Both the ability of control and to dismantle the systems that prevented that control. The more I look into these old arguments, the more they touch a nerve today. So this becomes a big thing in elections, and what else comes in is the creation of the new Christian right, the so-called moral majority. A lot of religious people thought it was wrong, and didn't want these hippies creating a level of moral decay and ambiguity in society, using abortion as a law of convenience. Also, I really do want to be nuanced here. Reagan, from as far as I could gather, had a moderate conservative view on abortion. Here's a quote from a fan letter he wrote to Charles Schulz about a 1970s peanut comic.
I could only reconcile abortion with the right of self-defense, namely the right of the mother to protect herself and her health against even her own unborn child if the birth of that child threatened her.
The moral majority was strictly no abortion for any reason, and there was a lot of people that didn't like how moderate he was for their taste. However, he was the anti-abortion candidate, and to quote the Washington Post article called "Reagan is favored by anti-abortionists," well, Reagan isn't perfect, but he's electable. To continue.
His position has won Reagan the support of most anti-abortion groups nationwide, giving him a built-in core of highly motivated activists in every state. The people who turn out to demonstrate against abortion in a downpour at dawn or wait in the cold for hours to shout their case at candidates, and reporters all believe that they represent a growing political force, and that the 1980 presidential campaign is their chance to prove it.
Oh, and before you say, gosh darn those Republicans, a lot of the people voting for him were Dems and Independents. And the quote I used about moral decay was by Reverend Jesse James. As I said, the situation was not black and white. It was very messy. Also, the same year that Atwood finished her book, Reagan enacted the Mexico City Act, a type of grants and aid bullying that prevents nonprofits from getting money if they're associated with abortions in any way, shape, or form. There is some nuance there, but another time. So it definitely makes sense why Atwood would be writing a story about reproductive rights, especially when the last decade was committed to the question of whether or not abortion was right or wrong, and how reproductive justice dovetails with a woman's ability to life, liberty, and the pursuit of... you get it. Now, we get to what is probably the most obvious visual comparison, the veiling of women. Yes, folks, we need to talk about the Islamic Revolution and the whole hijab thing. And because this conversation has to get very xenophobic by Westerners very quickly, we're getting a nuanced discussion of the topic. Also, Iran just happens to be a religious fundamentalist theocracy, and it's a nice parallel to what happens when the religious right gains control. That does sound awfully familiar, doesn't it? So first, what is the Islamic Revolution? Short answer is that it's very complicated, but I'll do my best. Essentially, the revolution is taking the country from a monarchy to a democracy, but the politics are a lot more complicated than that. Essentially, the country was run by Shah Mohammad Pahlavi, and while I don't understand a lot of things about his reign, he was into modernization, utilizing Iran's oil for globalization, and a lot of economic and social reforms. The issue with that was that a lot of his reforms failed. His land reforms backfired due to lack of infrastructure. Instead of creating a socialist utopia, he just stratified the classes. Basically, he pissed off both the working class and the clergy, as he also de-emphasized traditional religious legal structures. Also, oil prices went up, and there was a lot of inflation, and then in turn caused a lot of distrust for his foreign policy, and a lot of people felt that he was being influenced by American imperialism. In comes Ruhollah Khomeini. He's a professor, a cleric. He writes this book called Valai Faqih, which is like, fuck the West. We need to isolate and deal with all this libertine bullshit that's ruining our country. You know, reject modernity, embrace tradition. And it caught on. Now, I do need to mention that this is a text filled with embracing religious fundamentalism, and has a strange emphasis on an isolationist country that needs to weed out foreign influences, including some very clear anti-Semitism. I don't want to be the person judging another culture with my bare bones Wikipedia understanding, but it's pretty hard to see Khomeini as anything but a fascist. Okay, so we have a proto-fascist starter kit. Civil unrest, strong religious movement with social conservative values, ineffective government. Boom! Welcome to the Islamic Republic of Iran, a theocratic democracy. So now that we know what the players are at the table, let's talk about the headscarf in the room, the hijab. Before we begin, there is a lot of nuance in this discussion, and I heavily dislike a lot of modern discourse that attempts to damsel or tokenize the wearing of hijab. It is an incredibly complicated cultural and religious issue, and I find that most Westerners don't respect or sympathize with the Muslim women and feminists that actually discuss this. First, it is a really common misconception that the hijab refers simply to a headscarf, which is very misguided. Hijab relates to the spiritual concept of modesty and is not gender-specific. For instance, hijab in men would mean not to show body hair, like on your arms and chest, not to wear flashy jewelry or tight-fitting clothing that shows off one's figure. It's ideally a spiritual practice, and people practice it for a variety of reasons. In 1936, Reza Shah, the father of Mohammad Pahlavi, enacted the Kashif Hajib, or unveiling, which banned the use of headscarves and chadors. Women would literally have them ripped off their heads if they wore them in public, which meant the more traditional women began to isolate themselves. Pahlavi decriminalized the wearing of hijab during his reign, so in the mid-70s it was pretty common to not wear a headscarf for everyday life. Then the eve of the revolution came, and headscarves took on more political importance. It was a way of signaling they supported the more traditional resistance. Other women wore them as a response to the topic of westernization, specifically as a way of combating the Western idea of women as sex symbols, which mirrors some modern feminist discourse about hijab. Regardless, wearing a headscarf in 78, you were most likely trying to say something. A year later, on March 7, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini announced that the wearing of the hijab was mandatory, and that there would be structural oppression if you refused to wear it, being fired, arrested, whipped. You get the picture. The next day, which happened to be International Women's Day of all things, thousands of women and allies marched in Tehran to protest. All this was going on when Atwood wrote the book, The Rise of the Religious Right in America, the feminist discussion of why reproductive freedom is important, a president who sided with conservative radicals, a whole country that went from a liberal, modernized social monarchy to a theo-fascist regime in the matter of a decade, and a world where isolationist countries full of ideologues were the norm. Putting all this together, it's pretty easy to see where Atwood got her inspiration for Gilead, and how, just like Iran, it only takes a few years of economic turmoil and a populist uprising to change who controls everything about a country.
Act 2. The Belletrist discusses the Gilead Republic. I wish this story was different. I wish it was more civilized. I wish it showed me in a better light. If not happier, then at least more active, less hesitant, less distracted by trivia. I wish it had more shape. I wish it was about love, or about sudden realizations important to one's life, or even about sunsets, birds, rainstorms, or snow.
You know, I do wish this story was different. I wish to be like Professor Pizzotto, waxing poetic about archival and lacunas, telling you about what I liked about this book, the stream of consciousness, these themes of ownership and transaction, the visual motif of colors and flowers. But I can't. I am the Belletrist. I am a storyteller. And unfortunately, I have a job to do. So instead of being Professor Pizzotto, I have to be Atwood, or Alfred, or somebody else. I have to tell you a story about society. First, let's get the big chestnut out of the way. Is Gilead fascist? I mean, that's hard to say, because Gilead is definitely a dictatorship, surely authoritarian, but I'm a writer, not a politician. However, fascism does tell a story, and we might as well discuss that. Let us focus on the narrative of fascism.
1. The mythic state. Fascists believe in a sort of golden age, a period where people kept to themselves and we didn't tolerate the bad sort. You know, the infirm, pagans, sodomites, barbarians. No, we all kept to ourselves and ordered us palm fronds and bunches of grapes. Now obviously this is a fetishization, an appeal to antiquity. As they say, reject modernity, embrace tradition. 2. Tradition. With the focus on the mythic state, they evoke traditional systems. Within that traditional system, it demands society conform to traditional hegemonic roles. Those that fall outside of that, gimps, the sexual intermediaries, the melanated, are often seen as outliers at best and traitors at worst. 3. The invasion. Umberto Eco discusses how fascism demands struggle for struggle's sake. There is always a battle, always an enemy. The enemy is not just a combatant but a disease. It's miscegenation, it's degeneracy, it's corruption through cultural imperialism. The disease must be staved off, it must be stamped out to protect the people, the mythic and now present nation. 4. The nation. Fascism describes tribalism, yes, a monolithic and hegemonic culture, of course, but also a very strong sense of collectivism. It's not simply every man his ability, it's every man his zealotry. To be with us, you must drive out the invader yourself. You are the hero, you are the protector, but you must also be a believer, because those of little faith are just as bad as the invaders.
Now, I've been a bit vague on the actual elements of fascism, and for that I request you to spend some time reading upon Umberto Eco and other theorists. Now that we have these elements, let us apply them to Gilead. Well, Gilead is a biblical name, but I would argue that the mythic state is a little less literal here. The rejection of modernity is an embrace for Vikings, or for Rome, or some Golden Age caliphate. It's more of a rejection of secularism. It's a fetishization of the papal state rather than the political one. This means that the traditional system is more explicitly religious, a very specific focus on strict gender roles, and, of course, biblical womanhood. This, of course, also follows a rejection of sodomites and heathens, and more general rejections of socialists and other causal victims of the system. But here is what we get to a very specific variant of the fascism. In Gilead, the enemy is infertility, which means that infertile women are ostracized, celibate women, like nuns, are assimilated and killed, and homosexuals are killed for gender treachery. As you can imagine, acts of onanism are frowned upon in this world. And yes, you might think to yourself, sure, this is a theogony, but the beef lies on a religious front. Well, yes and no. There are two main people killed in Gilead. People of the wrong religion, Muslims, Buddhists, Quakers, Roman Catholics, and so on, and the so-called gender treacherers, abortionists, divorcees, rapists, onanists, sex pests. But remember, fascism adopts the power of the traditional system, which means in our society, things like racism and sexism. In one chapter, Atwood discusses how the children of Ham, which is a religious rhetoric used to justify the slave trade, would be sent to Home Colony 1, a work colony. In the afterword, Professor Pizzotto alludes to how society was concerned with declining Caucasian birth rates, a common trope in the Great Replacement myth. He also mentions how some Jews were sent to Zion, but that quite a few didn't make it.
The National Homeland and Jewish Bo-Person Plan were both Judd's, as was the idea of privatizing the Jewish reparation scheme, with the result that more than one boatload of Jews was simply dumped into the Atlantic to maximize profits. From what we know of Judd, it would not have bothered him much.
Now, we've discussed aesthetics and history, the Evangelists will proselytize on doctrine, but let's now touch base on civics. What does this nation look like? What is expected of its denizens? Essentially, all members of the society are broken into a strict caste system. The caste system focuses on household units with a series of families and servants. Commanders are high-ranking officials who are married to women simply known as wives. Most commanders have a handmaid, that is a state-sanctioned concubine that he is obligated to impregnate, as handmaids are the only fertile women in society. Because of this, they have high symbolic importance, but are treated rather poorly. The servants of this household consist of Marthas, domestic women who tend to be people of color, and guardians, who are essentially military valets, and this caste is occupied by men. While there are a few different outliers, the remaining castes are militant classes, like aunts, angels, and eyes, who enforce the regime, and the econo class, essentially non-military workers, though it should be noticed that econo men can earn the right to marriage through service to the party. Now, this of course bears very little weight to our broader discussion, but these motifs will be useful to remember when the Suffragette and Nativist take the stage.
Act 3. The Evangelist tells a tale in two parts, a devotional and a protest.
Blessed be. It is I, the Evangelist, here to spread the good word, help the downtrodden, and to weed out false prophets. To quote Miss Atwood, "This book is not anti-religious. It is against the use of religion as a front for tyranny, which is a different thing altogether. Gilead is nothing but a bastardization of the good word. It only allows scripture to be meted out and interpreted for the patriarch, and the conclusions they make serve Caesar much more than our good Lord above. I want to speak to you upon two fronts. One, a quick devotional for those outside the faith, and two, how the bastards corrupt the good book." Atwood references quite a few different verses throughout the story, but three concepts pop up over and over again: the sons of Jacob, the Beatitudes, and the three theological virtues. So here's a million-dollar question. What is a handmaid? Essentially a female servant, but like a lot of gospel, it gets muddled in the fine print. The original Hebrew used, Ema and Shifka, can translate to servant but also slave. The two times handmaidens are mentioned, they are given to wife. Now, some interpretations take it literally as to marry, though others take it a bit more cornerly. Regardless, handmaidens in Genesis are used to describe maidservants who become concubines. The only thing unknown is their consent in the matter. This concept in Genesis is mentioned twice. Hagar is given to Abraham, and Zilpah and Bilhah are given to Jacob, and these two accounts share some similarities. 1. In both cases, the use of the handmaiden was due to the wife's infertility, and 2. In both cases, the use of the handmaiden was important to the mythos of the mythic state. Let's look at this through Gilead's lens. Hagar gave birth to Ishmael, who is considered a patriarch to modern-day Arabs, and the ancestor of Muhammad, peace be upon him. Sarah, the wife, gave birth to Isaac, who is the patriarch for Judea. Jacob, between his 4 wives, gave birth to 12 sons, who are believed to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. In either case, the use of the handmaid helped secure the birth of a nation. The other interpretation here is the focus on Rachel and Leah. In chapter 15, the sermon given reads almost verbatim Genesis 30, the birth of the sons of Jacob, but curiously enough, leaves out the sons of Rachel, whose fertility was gifted by God. This of course mirrors Sarah's own infertility, which is implied to be due to menopause. After Ishmael is born, God once again opens her womb and allows her to give birth to Isaac. I find it telling that Gilead would preach that God's plan was for the wise in fertility and to celebrate biblical polygamy, while making sure to promptly ignore when God worked miracles. In a very traditional sense, though, I'm sure the Suffragette will have something to say about it, the wise are rewarded by giving the handmaids, and the handmaids, under historical law, would have had their children inherit the birthright of their master. Under Gilead's eye, God does not grant fertility, only the shame of barrenness, and the handmaids, when they have done their duty, gain very little in social capital. Let us move on to the New Testament, specifically the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are a series of blessings given by Christ our Lord in his Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the merciful, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those that hunger and thirst for righteousness. Even those that are not familiar with the scripture have probably heard these verses before. The Beatitudes are referenced in two different passages. Chapter 5, page 64.
I've learned to do without a lot of things, said Aunt Lydia. You get too attached to this material world, and you forget your spiritual values. You must cultivate poverty of spirit. Blessed are the meek. She didn't go on to say anything about inheriting the earth.
And chapter 1589, as part of the sermon.
For lunch it was the Beatitudes. Blessed be this, blessed be that. They played it from a tape, so not even an ant would be guilty of the sin of reading. The voice was a man's. Blessed be the spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed be the meek. Blessed are the silent. I knew they made that up. I knew it was wrong, and they left things out too, but there was no way of checking. Blessed be those that mourn, for they shall be comforted.
Now, as we all know, there are some differences between the gospel, but blessed be the silent has never been inscribed in red ink. So let us focus on the other blessings. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they will inherit the kingdom of heaven. Blessed be the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Now, that sounds a bit odd to the ear, doesn't it? Elodie tells Offer to be both meek and poor in spirit, but don't these rewards contradict? And why poor in spirit? I know that God says if we have the faith of a mustard seed, but surely heaven's reward is for those that are wise and bring enough oil for their lamp. Now, blessed are the meek is not a plea for passivity or inaction, but rather a plea for absolution.
Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down as the grass, and wither as the green herb. Rest in the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in his way, because of the man who bringeth wicked desires to pass. Cease from anger, and forsake wrath. Fret not thyself in any wise to do evil, for evildoers shall be cut off. But those that wait upon the Lord, they shall inherit the earth.
The meek, simply put, give it to God and turn the other cheek. Well, what about the poor in spirit? From the myriad of scholars on the topic, most agree that this poverty is not literal. Think of it as being more humble within our faith, believing but asking God to help with our unbelief. The poor in spirit are not self-righteous, rather, they realize that without God they are nothing. The use of the Beatitudes during the sermon mirrors Psalm 37, and many other similar verses that are meant as a platitude, to assure us that the iniquity of the world is but temporary. The first allusion to it is more palpable. Lydia first tells Offer that she must focus on her spiritual gifts, that doing without is poverty of spirit. This is a base misreading of the scripture. First, because as we have already covered, this poverty in spirit is not a vow of poverty, but second, because God does not ask for asceticism. Well, at least not directly. The scripture makes it clear that we should renounce worldly pleasure, that is, pleasure that causes us to sin. The Lord does not speak specifically on asceticism, and some sects practice it at times, just as Jesus did in the desert. However, the Lord makes it clear that it's faith, not denial, that is important. I believe this is from Corinthians.
Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to dispute over doubtful things. For one believes he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. Who are you to judge another's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand.
I understand this to mean that different persons must avoid different temptations. Think of it like the way someone who is recovering from addiction might need to avoid a variety of substances or other addicts because it harms their recovery, whilst a sober person who doesn't have that experience does not have to curtail their behavior. The main religious issue here is that, ironically, by preaching unneeded asceticism, Aunt Lydia has created a haughtiness of spirit. The purity of doing without becomes another form of self-righteousness, the very thing she preaches against. Now, I feel like I truly understand why Atwood would reference the passage so often, and there's two effects happening: the opiate of religion and the shame of it. Gilead tells the handmaids to trust in the second coming, to avoid critiquing Caesar, that in time the baddies will get what's coming to them. However, Gilead does not seem to realize that they are the workers of iniquity. It is the abuser obfuscating their abuse. Gilead also uses his religion as a bully pulpit, utilizing piety instead of loyalty. If you don't believe, truly believe, then you must not be worthy. Venos pati, venost atsu. I want to make one smaller point before we tie in this Bible study into the grander scheme of things. Simply put, Offred has a pillow in her room labeled Hope. She later mentions that it's supposedly one of 3 pillows. Those that have been to Bible study realize this is an allusion to 1 Corinthians 13:13, in which Paul commands us to have faith, hope, and charity. Now, those that practice exegesis may also recognize that faith, hope, and charity are part of the 7 heavenly virtues, and before we do breach this topic, it is a common misunderstanding that the 7 heavenly virtues contrast the 7 deadly sins. This is false. Those are a completely set of virtues known as the 7 contrary or capital virtues. A small pet peeve of mine. The 7 heavenly virtues are further split into 2 categories, cardinal and theological. The cardinal virtues stem from classic philosophy, but the theological, our darling 3, are biblical. Also, the term virtue here is a bit ironic. Virtues tend to be things you gain through practice, like temperance or forgiveness. But the theological virtues are something that's divinely given. God, help my unbelief. This seeds that are planted, and the way for them to blossom is by having the poorness of spirit of wanting to believe. The fact that faith is singled out and repeated so often is a curious thing to me. Faith in what exactly? To that, I don't have a good answer. It is a vagary that I still reflect upon. Now, generally, I do like to end a Bible study with a prayer, but I was informed by the narrator that this doesn't sell the hot seats. So, I'll finish with this. Like all false prophets, fascism seems to give you easy answers to difficult questions. And just like in religion, this can lead to a just word fallacy, an assumption that the world is as the world should be. But remember, the militant Christian, the one that assumes that they understand the signs and seasons alone, that they are the sole mouthpiece for the divine, are the ones who are hearty in spirit. And we all know what happens to the prideful.
Act 4. The March of the Saxons. How the Suffragette speaks of Atwood. 100 Colombian pesos, a euro or $1 in exchange for 3 minutes. In this landscape we find the artist naked and lying on a bed. 3 minutes during which his body shall be property of whoever wants it and pays for it. 3 minutes in which a forced bond is the only possible bond.
In 2014, Spanish artist Abel Asconia did a 3rd performance of Empathy and Prostitution, in which he recreates the moment of his own conception as a way to empathize with his mother, who was a sex worker. This performance is recorded, and in the video it cuts between 2 scenes. Asconia, lying in a fetal position, neither clothed nor eroticized, and the various Johns who visit him. The more I think about this piece, the more my empathy goes to the Johns. And understand here, empathy, not sympathy. This piece makes me ask, what would I do if I stood there with $1 in my hands? How would I treat Asconia? There are 4 possible answers. You could give in to your desires and fuck him. You could comfort him, feed him, hold him, try to fix the pain others caused. You could hurt him. Nobody would stop you. Or 4, you could do nothing. You can make the choice not to place the $1 in that box. But at the end of the day, these actions ignore a few things. That the first 3 actions are the same action in a sense. They are all about the pleasure of the self. To interact with Asconia is to own him. And whether your pleasure is sexual, emotional, or sadistic, Asconia has no consent in the matter. He has to accept however you treat him. 2. No matter what action you take, it ignores not why Asconia is here, but that he is here. Asconia is Atlas. It doesn't really matter how he got the world on his shoulders. What matters is that he can't leave. Ownership is a strange thing, and it doesn't matter how benevolent you are, because without autonomy, nothing stops you from deciding to not be. In chapter 28, Offred thinks about the moment that she lost her bodily autonomy, when the sons of Jacob banned women from owning bank accounts and having jobs. Also, historical note, The right for women to own a bank account without a man's permission was enacted in 1974, less than a decade when Atwood began writing this book.
He kissed me then, as if now I said that, things could get back to normal. But something had shifted, some balance. I felt shrunken, so that when he put his arms around me, gathered me up, I was as a doll. I felt love going forward without me. He doesn't mind this, I thought. He doesn't mind it at all. Maybe he even likes it. We are not each other's anymore. Instead, I am his.
The thing to take away from this is passivity. When Asconian begins his performance, he becomes a passive player in the system. When a woman is married, she becomes a passive player in our society. Now, there's a lot to be said about relative power and ownership, but we will leave that for the Nativists. So let's talk about reproductive justice and what exactly it is. According to Reproductive Justice by Rickie, Solinger, and Loretta Ross, a book that I've absolutely read more than the first chapter of, because I am an adult with the capacity to read academia, reproductive justice is defined thus.
The definition of reproductive justice goes beyond the pro-choice, pro-life debate and has three primary principles. 1. The right to not have a child. 2. The right to have a child. And 3. The right to parent children in safe and healthy environments. At the heart of reproductive justice is this claim: all fertile persons and persons who reproduce and become parents require a safe and dignified context for these most fundamental human experiences.
First, this phrasing is deliberate, and there announces people who are capable of bearing children. The third principle here, in a safe and healthy environment, is also important to recognize. Picture in your mind a woman getting pregnant by her abuser, who will either hurt her during her pregnancy or trap her in the relationship. Imagine a woman who has too many kids already, and this missed period will mean another 20 more years of abject poverty. Imagine somebody with a serious drug addiction or who is going through chemo, and this pregnancy will severely threaten both their and their child's life. There's a lot of reasons not to have a child, and reproductive justice works on a lot of different levels, from contraception to sex education to creating accessibility of safe foster systems. It's a holistic approach. But let's be honest, the big elephant in the room is abortion. So why? I want to talk about a book series I read once. I was in high school, and I was really into urban fantasy, which is like paranormal romance, but sluttier. And I was reading the Mercy Thompson series by Patricia Briggs. Now, there's this one little backstory, I guess about a side character, complete throwaway, solid the earth world building, but basically it was talking about one of the characters' desires to have kids. Now, in this world, werewolves exist, and they are technically fertile, but it's very hard for them to come to terms because of transitioning during the full moon. You understand. And this werewolf talks about how he's dating this young co-ed, and she gets pregnant, and he's really exciting, and he's going to finally have children, and he gets home from work, and he finds a note in his apartment. And it turns out that she left him. She said she wasn't ready to have kids, that she had her whole life ahead of her, and that she had decided to get an abortion. And as you read this, there's this sadness to it, this palatable grief over what could have been. And Briggs actually parallels this in a later book, where the main character talks about how one of her exes basically groomed her to have kids because she's one of the few subhuman characters that is fertile. And as I read these passages, you can see the thought process behind the men in these books. And it's not malicious. It is a very human urge to have children, to raise a family, to have people you love, but in the process, they lose the sight that the women who would bear them risk everything for it. The women in these situations aren't women. They're vessels for a man's future happiness. And when I talk with pro-life men, is this focus on the children, of these perceived future happiness, and this moral assumption that what these women are doing is murder. And the more I hear that, the more I think about a quote from philosopher Abigail Thorne.
It doesn't matter whether or not fetuses are people. What matters is whether or not pregnant people are.
At the crux of it, there are two very different emotional images. For the pro-lifers, there's this image of happiness being denied, the lost-up PNG horror of the accidental miscarriage, being incarnated with malice aforethought. For the pro-choicers, there's this idea of quiverful women being forced to breed like cattle, stuck in awful, abusive marriages with no escape. And I think that's something we should mention. Pregnancy is another kind of ownership. Like they say, you can't stop being a parent. Once you have a kid, there's an obligation to provide a stable home life, even if that means that you protect them from the violence within. Once again, it doesn't matter how they got there, what matters is that they cannot leave. I think that it's safe to say that nobody wants to get an abortion. It's not fun. It's a difficult, traumatizing, and painful experience, exacerbated by zealots both within the walls and without. But I feel like most will say it is a necessary evil, a stopgate, a deus machina to prevent greater pain. To finish this, please allow me to continue a trend of odd quotations.
The Thera told me that long ago Elahira made a bargain with Frith. Frith promised him that rabbits were not to be born dead or unwanted. There's little chance of a decent life for them. It's a doe's privilege to take them back into her body unborn.
Dear Lord, please give me the temperance of rabbits.
Act 5. The Nativist speaks of relative power.
So, before we get into some of that turf shit, I do have to, rehash some recent drama. I mean, this is called Read the Controversy, okay? So here's the tea, here's the stitch. Margaret Atwood shared an opinion piece by Toronto Star editor Rosie Damanno called Why Can't We Say Women Anymore? Which, if that title doesn't tell you anything, here is literally the first sentence. Man, I feel like a person who menstruates. Apologies to Shania Twain, but this is where we're heading if language radicals get their way. So yeah, this is a boilerplate, gender-critical article to the point where it's not even funny or particularly well written. I had to pay money for this, and it was not worth it. So people were like, oh my goodness, Atwood, how could you? Are you a TERF now? And she's like, I'm not a TERF, guys. Read the article. And the drama is so trite and cliche that I'm not going to repeat it. So what now? 1. Atwood supporting this position is transphobic. The erasure of women in medical language is a TERF talking point, and by platforming this article, she has disseminated harmful rhetoric. 2. Does this make her a TERF, though? And the response is moo. Unask the question. It doesn't really matter. The thing we forget a lot in public discourse is that centrists will always parrot fascist and TERF talking points. Does Atwood have anti-trans beliefs? Who knows? But does she fit into this particular brand of white feminism that consumes a lot of TERF platitudes? I think you know the answer. And when we consider that The Handmaid's Tale is a book about a patriarchal society that literally reduces women to their reproductive function, you can see how that dovetails pretty well with how TERFs view the world. However, at this point, I feel like I have clickbaited a little. TERFs do play a part in this story, but more symbolically. TERFs are in a sense simply another head of the Hydra. A symptom, but not the cause. If you would like a literal analysis of how TERFs read the book, I do recommend watching Jesse Gender's amazing video on the topic. It goes into the subject with more depth and insight than I'm capable of, and it was the inspiration for this segment. So please, pay homage to the greats and then come back to finish. Oh good, you're back. There's a quote from the foreword that stuck with me.
Yes, women will gang up on other women. Yes, they will accuse others to keep themselves off the hook. We see that very publicly in the age of social media, which enables group swarmings. Yes, they will gladly take positions of power over other women, even, and possibly especially, in systems in which women as a whole have scant power. All power is relative, and in tough times any amount is seen as better than none.
In The Handmaid's Tale, we see that statement taken to its highest extreme. There's ironically no charity in Gilead. Everything is a transaction, everything is a power struggle, and every single boon and buff is hard-won in a thick, treacherous landscape. On a more obvious level, there are the aunts and wives who wield their limited power as a cudgel, but then there's the coolness of the Marthas who infantilize the handmaids, and even in the earliest chapter, Offred uses her feminine wiles to tease one of the guardians using what little power she has as a weapon. But The Handmaid's Tale is set in a hyper-focused caste system. How does it track to the here and now? I alluded to it before, but let's talk about white feminism. So we're going to go all the way back to 1913. It's the Women's Suffrage March. Hail Columbia, for she rides upon a white steed, saying, Hark, the future is female. But Therein lies the rub. There's only supposed to be a certain kind of woman at this march. When Ida B. Wells showed up with her Illinois delegation, she was informed that we must have a white procession and a Negro procession, or no procession at all. Luckily, Ida B. Wells said, "Fuck racism," because she is that much of a bad bitch. But let's not forget the snake in the grass here. Considering that they wore green and purple, you'd think that they'd be a little bit more colorblind. But here's the thing, white suffragists didn't want to showcase black women's concerns because that hurt their own case with all those good old boys down south. Black men as well didn't want black women's suffrage because it hurt their own respectability. A white woman speaking above her station is a bit eccentric. A black woman, a bit uppity. And this dichotomy of the degenerate and the respectable sort repeats itself over and over again. Think about it this way. Being accepted by society is like moving to a suburb. Only the right kind of people get to move in. You have to fit in, and some people will never be respectable enough to go through those gates. Girl bosses are a good example of this. Sure, these women hold some of the power in society, but they do that at the cost of inoculating what makes them politically dangerous. Think working girl. Sigourney Weaver isn't the villain because she's a woman. She's a villain because instead of changing the system, she clings and maintains her seat at the table. Weaver doesn't threaten the status quo, and that's why she gets to stay there. However, I do think that I am oversimplifying this a bit. Sure, there's definitely nice white cis gay men out there who don't want to be associated with these freaks and kinksters, because they're trying to adopt a baby and start a nice, heteronormative, pure Christian life. You know, like all Americans want. But there's also exclusions that are done not just out of fear of the oligarchs, but of fear of the other, the threat to their own hegemony. In White Feminism, Beck discusses how in the International Commission of Women, an international group between feminists in the Americas, that the American feminists were unable to see how they in the global South had differing needs concerning foreign policy. To actually recognize their critiques, white feminists like Doris Stevens would have to acknowledge that America exploited the fuck out of Latin and South America, and that a part of their feminism includes America not being the good guy. In other words, Stevens' nationalism blinds her from that perspective. TERFs are another example of this. A lot of the anger of TERFs comes from the ways that trans and non-binary people mess with the gender binary. This gender fuck perspective puts in question a lot of the innate assumptions TERFs have about gender and sex, and that instability is met with resentment. I think we're onto something here, but I think we can go a bit further. So in Jessie Gender's video, she discusses how TERFs place themselves in the role of the handmaids, and trans people as the wives. There's a distinct level of martyrdom here. TERFs like to talk about how trans women haven't suffered the way we've suffered, that they've lived their halcyon days in the patriarchy, and are now slumming it with the pussy havers. Here's the thing, it's not a competition. Like, yes, people do have it objectively worse than others, but their pain, their fight for rights, doesn't take away yours. Like, I'm a secularist, but I think the Evangelist was onto something earlier. This martyrdom is a haughtiness of spirit. It's assigning moral worth to being oppressed, but here's the thing. All oppression is bad oppression. The only people who are #sliving are the commanders, the literal and tangible patriarchy. Everyone else's lives, the handmaids, the Marthas, the wives, hell, even the guardians, are living pretty dour lives. And even then, Gilead has a slave class. You can become an unperson, a non-entity who goes without the breads and fishes that Gilead doles out. As fucked as it is in the society, being a handmaid is still part of the suburb. What I'm trying to get at here is that Gilead is a more exaggerated society, so it's easy to see the flaws in it. The Handmaid's Tale, people are strictly divided by the caste system, and they allow that division to spark resentment and distrust. They moralize their own pain in the system, and instead of using that as empathy, of understanding this common thread of pain we all share in a system, is used to distance ourselves, to act as a cudgel, because you haven't suffered how I've suffered. And there's another failure of empathy here, how we have treated the symptoms of pain but not the cause. As the Suffragette says, trying to comfort Abedisconia does nothing to actually fix his problem. And that sucks, because life is messy. We don't have a literal patriarch, a cruel god that we can enact deicide upon. And that sucks, because life is messy. We don't have a literal patriarch, a cruel god that we can enact deicide upon. We personify a patriarchy, a shadowy cabal of shitty old white men smoking cigars in a back room cackling, which... Okay, that is a very good depiction of Congress, but That imagery is also a type of narrative, a way of us conceptualizing the eldritch abominations which is systematic injustice. This hegemonic Rube Goldberg trap of laws and social customs that act as a razor wire society. And we are all cogs in that machine. So yes, we have to smash the patriarchy, get rid of the literal shitty old white men, but to do that, we have to have a better society to replace it. We have to acknowledge that while human rights and dignity aren't a finite resource, sometimes power is. To quote Beck again,
"The whole feminism is everywhere now narrative has an almost gaslighting effect on women of color, in which we're being told by a broader mainstream dialogue that our lives are so much better when we're actually just an asterisk in a wage gap statistic. Because when you remove white, economically comfortable women from the gender landscape, feminism isn't quite everywhere. Change in gender politics hasn't come fast. For many women, it hasn't come at all."
When we don't acknowledge our own power, our own bias within the system, then when you call for feminism, the question is, feminism for who? Reproductive rights for who? The only way to avoid becoming the next oppressor, of creating another suburb, is to unify collective interests, and for people that have little power, that means giving some of it up. Tourists don't want to give up their limited power they have by dismantling the gender binary. Black men in the 1910s don't want to give up the limited power they had to support black women's suffrage. Hell, poor whites didn't support abolition because of their relative power in the South. And it's hard to give up power. It's hard to admit that sometimes you, or people like you, are the villains in another person's story. But the thing that unifies, the thing that separates us from the fascists, is realizing that there are no degenerates. There are none that are rich in spirit. There are people who need different things, and a just society knows that a rising tide lifts all ships.
Denouement. The end of the road. Hello? Hello, is this thing on? Oh, I guess it is. Well, dear listeners, I guess I should tell you how the play went. Let's just say that posting a play, having it in a place in a common crowd, can sometimes be a mixed bag. And some days we are praised and rewarded, showered with accolades and gold coins. And in other places we have to leave town pretty quickly. I won't say which way this play fell, this performance went, but the word seditionist may have been thrown around there somewhere. It is now, as we are hidden, obfuscated behind tape and electricity, time and space, that I will tell you one last tale of Concordance. In September of 2022, a woman by the name of Mahsa Amini was found dead in a hospital under suspicious circumstances, thought to be brought upon by the effects of police brutality. This in turn was the straw that broke the camel's back. There were protests, there were many protests, and there are many different things happening in the state of Iran. A revolution might be brewing. There is also the case of the United States. 11 states have banned abortion.
Others are holding a wary holding pattern, and others have opened their arms to embrace the flood that will come. And there's a tension in the air. There is weighted breath, because we do not know where exactly the chips will fall. America is in the city of Dis, and we have yet to walk into the cold embrace of the ninth circle, to climb down Lucifer's back and emerge in Purgatorio. It will be an uphill climb. It will be a battle. And right now, the troops are maintaining their positions. The last thing that I want to rest upon, mentally, emotionally, philosophically, is the notion that Gilead, according to Professor Bezzotto, was an era. The Gilead era. A finite period of time with a rise and a fall, and a life and existence beyond it. A good life and existence beyond it. A better life and existence beyond it. And I think that what is important to remember is not faith, it is not charity, it is hope. It is the notion that whatever we are about to go through, whatever we have gone through, will end. Things will happen, empires will fall, and we will emerge in a world that is, hopefully, a little bit better. And I just want you to hold that to your breast. I want you to remember that Gilead will fall. Every bad regime, every unjust society will fall eventually. And that is not a platitude. That is not telling us to be meek. It's telling us to be patient, to know that we are stronger than this, to not let the bastards get us down. I wanted to find some biblical verse out there that would have first made the Evangelist proud, but also have just said something succinctly. It really does feel a bit more mystical when it's written in a Latin script, doesn't it? But I wasn't able to find anything concrete. So let's return to that vagary we discussed. The question of faith. Why faith? Not hope, which would have been the most obvious, not charity, which Gilead severely needs, but faith. Well, faith is a belief in something that you can't prove. It's believing in something that nearly contradicts your lived reality. It is magical thinking in its most literal form. And I think that sometimes you have to question, what do you believe? What do you have faith in? And I think that the most things we can say is that we have to have faith in something. We have to believe that the world is going to be different from the way we see it. We need to believe in some sort of ideal that we will strive for. And so picture that in your mind. Have faith in the future that you need, the future that you want to exist, in knowing that there are things that will happen that are not quite here yet. Keep that faith. March forward. And pretty soon we will find ourselves out of Gilead. We will get to the end of the road, and we will find something better.